Good morning or afternoon or evening, everybody. My name is Elisa Baum, and I am Percona's Director of Product Marketing. We'll begin in just a moment, but first I'd like to conduct some preliminary house cleaning. If you could please raise your hand using the hand icon in the GoToWebinar control panel. This will let me know that you can hear me okay. So if you wouldn't mind just pushing on that button and letting me know that you can hear me, that would be very much appreciated. Let's see here. Do we have hands? I see hands. Thank you guys very much. Next, during this webinar, you will be on mute. Should you have any questions at all, just go ahead and enter them in the questions field within the GoToWebinar control panel. At the end of the webinar, we'll take as much time as we have left to answer your questions, and those that we don't get to will be answered in a follow-up blog post. And in addition, Fernando will reach out to you individually with some answers to your questions too. So I'd also like to let you know that a recording of this webinar will be made available within 48 hours after we're done today. And with that said, I'd like to thank you for attending today's webinar, MySQL on Windows, a survival guide for Linux-based DBAs, presented by Fernando Ipar. He is Percona's Senior Consultant. With that said, I'll turn the floor over to Fernando. Go ahead, Fernando.
Thanks, Elisa. Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming. If there's any problem with the audio or anything else, just raise your hand or ask a question, and Elisa will let me know. That said, let me get started here. Okay, so I need to start with some basic introduction, only relevant to the presentation. Just so you know, I've been with Percona since 2009, working in a few teams, but for the last 2.5 years or so, I've been a consultant and dealing mostly with a lot of emergency cases and data recoveries and things like that. And most of my work here involves Linux or some other Unix flavor, but mostly Linux. But a lot of the cases recently, especially emergencies, are coming in from Windows, and so I thought it would be interesting to try and share with other guys coming from my same background how to do good work in that platform. So basically, why I should be here is because I learned a little bit of how to be a bit more productive. Probably not the natural Windows way, but at least letting me make through some of those emergency cases that I mentioned. Most of the problems that I had are, like getting frustrated with the interface, or especially remote access, like having a shared screen or similar. It's pretty, frustrating if you're used to something as simple as SSH in a terminal. But, that said, when I get those cases, I realized eventually that I could either get angry, frustrated, and all that, or I could take it as a chance to improve. And so basically that's what I did, and then I try to put those little tips together into this webinar. So here's an actual phrase that I told a colleague during one of these cases. I know it probably seems like a stretch, that it will help you be a better human being. Surely not that much, but it does help develop patience. I can tell you that patience is a very important skill for somebody dealing with people and computers, especially during emergencies. So let's see, and let's go ahead and embrace this opportunity. So roughly today, I'll start by highlighting some of the biggest differences in running MySQL on Windows versus Unix. And then I'll provide some tips to how to feel more at home, either by making Windows a bit more like Linux, or by adopting the right Windows tools when needed. In some cases, there's just no good way to make this work as we're used to, but there are pretty good tools on the Windows side that we should definitely learn how to use. And so finally, I'll do a quick review of which parts of Percona Toolkit you should be able to use on Windows. I must say up front now that I'll only be covering plain MySQL here. By plain, I just mean MySQL Server and MyISAM or InnoDB. I will not be talking at all about NDB cluster, Galera, or any exotic storage engine. All my experience running MySQL on Windows is just with the plain version. Okay, so let's go through the differences then. The first thing is case sensitivity. MySQL uses a file system to store its files. This is independent of what storage engine you're using, and therefore its case sensitivity should be in line with whatever the file system does. In Windows, or for example in my OS is Mac, in a desktop Mac, you'll be running a case-insensitive file system. So this example shows it is case-insensitive, but within the same statement you need to be consistent. So that example actually won't work. You need to put the same case on the column name A there for it to work. One small comment here, there's a variable that's called lowercase table names. And the manual says that if you're using InnoDB, this should be set to 1 independent of the platform so that the comparisons are all done in lowercase. So that's one thing to take into consideration here. The path separator on Windows is an escape character on MySQL, so you can't just use it directly. This is similar to what happens in Java, in case any of you has experience with that. So you'll basically end up using almost familiar paths. You know, it's almost like using a Unix path, just that you have the drive name at the start. Yeah, I put an example there also of a load data in file command, and you can see that you just use the / and it works just fine. So in that case, it's the only change to make. The command line client. Okay, so the command line client that comes with the Windows installer, I think it will let you down if you're used to the Unix one. So Windows users are encouraged to use the workbench, but that's not always convenient when working remotely. Like I said, typically this is either some screen sharing software, or even if you're using remote desktop. You know, in my experience at least, you know, I prefer to use command line. It's much better and works better across slow connections and whatnot. And so in this case, I prefer to use the client package that comes with Cygwin. I'll talk more about this in a later section, so I won't say much more here. But the things that I say there in the slide, the built-in command line client that comes with Windows has no support for pager. If some of you don't know what that is, you can ask the question and I'll answer at the end. But it's really useful. I would not know how to live without that using MySQL. And it also has not support for GNU read line, so you don't have all of the good command line editing that you have in the standard Unix command line client. Symlinks. This is one thing that can get confusing if you jump back and forth between platforms a lot, because the meaning is really distinct, different, nothing to do. On Unix, you can symlink to MyISOM files basically, while on Windows you can create the analog. I honestly don't know if it's called a symlink or not on Windows, but you can use that to database directories. So in Unix case, you can basically just relocate large MyISOM tables if you run out of space, for example, or if you want to move them to a different drive for performance reasons. You can do that with symlinks. In Windows, you can do it, but with the whole database directory. The gotcha there is that it does not work with InnoDB file per table. Obviously, this means that on Windows, and it's the same on Unix, you end up having all of your InnoDB data on the same logical drive. Because if you're not using InnoDB file per table, you have a single large IB data file, and that's where all your data resides. And if you do have this enabled on Windows, then you cannot use symlinks. So every individual IBD file will still be on the same location. I don't really advocate use of symlinks, probably because working typically on Unix and with InnoDB, they don't have a big place in my life. But while on Windows you can use them a bit more, I still would advise against it. I think it's just confusing in the end. And the best choice, if you just need to grow, is to use some kind of file system that can be extended. And if the problem is performance, you need to resolve it at the I/O layer and not with this kind of hackish tricks. Just having more spindles or RAID or anything that actually resolves the problem and not works around it. Okay, so this is a long one. The configuration options. Some options are exclusive to Windows, and some have a different meaning when used there than in Unix. The standalone one instructs MySQL to not run as a Windows service. So this is an option that gets patched to the daemon when it's starting. To be honest, I don't know enough about Windows to say why this matters, but I can guess that some use cases like test instances, like things like XMPP, may be using this. Normally when I use Windows and MySQL, I use it as a service and it starts automatically. So the install options actually installs MySQL as a Windows service with the name. So this option gets an argument that is the service name. If you use install manual, it's the same, only that it won't start automatically when the server boots. And remove, basically just remove the service. The slow start timeout tells Windows Service Control Manager how long to wait until killing MySQL for not starting. This is completely alien to me as I'm used to init scripts just waiting for it to come up. But I think you should consider this if you run MySQL on Windows, mostly because of the crash recovery time. So what this happens is if the service manager starts MySQL and this timeout passes, and this is measured in seconds, it will kill the server. And if you, for example, have very large interview log files and the server goes down because of a crash, because power outage or whatever, then potentially you will have a long time doing crash recovery, and you can get into some kind of crash kill start crash loop. So you should definitely set this high enough to avoid that kind of problem. The socket is one of the variables that has a different meaning. In Unix, this is the path to the Unix domain socket, and in Windows, it's the name of the pipe, which by default is MySQL. And this only works if you're also using that other option, enable name pipe. Name pipes are only supported in Windows for communication with MySQL. The shared memory options are also Windows only. It's similar to the socket one. It's another access or a communication way with the database, and you just need to put the shared memory base name, and that's it. Then the option separator is, at least in some cases, is a semicolon, while on using is the colon. So for example, I put there temporary directory, that's one example. Instead of separating multiple paths there with the colon, you use the semicolon. This is also, I think, similar to class path in Java or things like that. And finally, interview flash method in Windows, the only one that is supported is async and buffered. So there's no way to change it. Not much to say here, only that you cannot tune this. There are two other options. I mean, in case you inspect either the source code or try them, they are called normal and unbuffered, but those are not documented and only for testing. So there's a bug report actually mentioning that they only use it for testing before making releases, but nothing else can be used in production. Well, another major difference is that there are no Percona binaries on Windows. I say this on all my presentations involving Percona tools. We are 100% customer driven, and so far we have not received customer requests for Windows builds. It is definitely not out of the question, and I have actually seen some beta builds and some colleagues who work in development sometimes make builds for themselves, but we don't have these public, at least not consistently. So to consider that. You can try and build them yourself, of course, and otherwise you can obviously contact GAT for a request. And the same applies to extra backup. And so this means that for making backups in Windows, basically the options initially would be MySQL dump, or you can use MySQL Enterprise Backup from Oracle, which does support Windows. So there may be other options, analog to like LVM snapshots are in Unix, but I have never used them or encountered live on servers. Typically, I just see the Enterprise Backup or MySQL dump. You can, if you have some kind of mixed environment, I have worked with customers who have mostly Windows servers because they use MySQL on par with another application that is Windows only, and they get support for Windows, but they have other servers which are Linux. Then you can just set up a slave of the Windows machine, and you can use extra backup there, for example, or MySQL dump, but at least it won't have any impact on the live server. So that covers the different section, and let's see now how we can feel a bit more at home while working on Windows. So the biggest piece of advice, and there's only one thing you take from this, is it has to be this, is to install Sigwin. Just the MySQL client package make its worth. It is far superior to the one that comes with the Windows installer. It's basically the same that you can use on Linux or any other Unix. So it has pager support, it has the read line. In general, it's much better. You can actually configure also, the .my.cnf file on your home directory in Sigwin, and it will work as expected. So a lot of scripts, anything that you may have, this will matter once we see the Percona Toolkit scripts. Everything with this configure will work just as fine as in Unix. Sigwin also includes Perl and Bash, which is required for running Percona Toolkit. And then, well, anything that you want. In my case, I typically get the VI editor and VMstat, which actually works quite well. But you have a lot of packages. It's a simple installer, and even when I'm working on emergency cases and the server does not have this installed, unless I really spot the problem right away, I tend to ask the customer to install this because it only takes like 5 minutes, And I think the productivity increase for somebody with a Unix command line background is much better and makes it worth it. I mean, I really have experience working in cases when I cannot do this, and everything to me is just lower. For example, because of the MySQL command line client. So during troubleshooting, and usually, normally as a DBA or as a sysadmin, measuring is a very important activity. So here, except for a surprisingly capable VMstat package that I mentioned already, I think we just have to adopt some native tools to do proper work. And so the two that I use the most are Resource Monitor and Performance Monitor. This, I think, came with anything more recent than Windows Vista. In my case with customers, I have typically seen 2012 server. That's also the version that I used to run my test while preparing this webinar. So I'm having all that in mind. But I think if you're using any Windows version that has less than 6 or 7 years in the market, you probably have these tools available. And so for Resource Monitor, think of it like kind of like Top with a graphic interface. To be honest, actually, I think it's better than Top. It's probably a bit like a mix of Top, VMstat, IOStat, and even Cacti, all of that with a graphic interface. It's actually pretty good. And for the Performance Monitor, just think more like OPerfile or dtrace. The comparisons are not perfect at all, but at least they will get you in the right direction and understanding these. So here's a view of the Resource Monitor while I'm running MySQL Slab. For this screenshot, I opened a couple of sections, the CPU and the disk sections. So you can see here what I said. It's a bit like an improved Top with other things because you don't have the disk view in Top, for example. The size of the graphs to the right, you can change them and give you, a nice visual overview of what's going on. And the tables let you see the details of, where all that CPU, disk, network, or memory is going. So I really use it a lot when troubleshooting servers. In this case, you can see I actually started MySQL Slab right in the middle when I had this running, and you can see the jump in the graphs there right away. The Performance Monitor is actually much more interesting, but it's also more useful to start using. It requires more investment on your side. This screenshot was also taken during a MySQL Slab run, and I'm using a data collector. You can see, you cannot see my pointer, but if you look at the tree there that starts with the performance roots, you can see one of the children is called data collector sets, and I created one especially for MySQL. And this is simple. You just create a new one and lets you add a lot of metrics and traces that you want to monitor. And in this case, I added a lot of things about drives and memory and processor. And once that's ready, you can just go ahead and either take a capture and save it to a file, or you can run it live. In this case, actually the screenshot is watching a capture that was read into a file. And you can see, again, the effect of the MySQL Slab running there. But for example, here is the same collector but run live. So in this case, it's a bit more like, a more detail-oriented cousin of Resource Monitor. It's, again, a bit like Top, but showing you more information and live. You can customize the data collector. You can hide values, as you can see there, where in the table it says show. You can just click there and hide things from the graph to make it more useful for you. Just focus on what you're looking for, and it really is pretty cool. Another interesting feature of this tool is that you can schedule the data collection process. This is very useful for us as consultants because it allows us to capture performance data during some interesting time, like peak traffic time, or whenever the customer says we need to see something, even if we're not around. It can be 3 a.m. my time, and I can still scale this, and on the other day I'll have the data saved on a file. So if you're using or you plan to use MySQL on Windows regularly, I really recommend reading Microsoft TechNet's articles on this, the Windows Performance Monitor, because really, believe me, it's going to pay off a lot for you. Okay, so now let's talk a bit about Percona Toolkit. First thing I have to say here is that officially this is only supported on Linux, so not just Unix at large, but Linux only. So anything I say today is just my advice to help you work better in Windows, but it's not an official, we don't support it. That said, basically, Pro tools tend to work mostly fine. And of course, it depends on how much they depend on things that are specific to the platform, but most of the Perl tools these days are pretty much platform agnostics, and the bash tools are more of a surprise. Some of them do, some don't. And of course, again, those that have more dependencies of specific things like, hoping some files on the proc file system, things like that, those tend not to work. Okay, I had to move the cursor. I hope it is out of the picture now. Otherwise, let me know. So as how to run this on Windows, Percona Toolkit, I prefer to Win. Active Perl is supposed to work too with the Perl tools, of course. But the reason I prefer Win is that it lets me run the bash tools too, and I get a lot of other goodies with it, like I said, DI and everything else. So I typically have done this with Win, but I know some people run it with Active Perl. Here's the list of tools that I have used successfully on Windows. All of them have worked for me one way or the other. In PTQuery Digest case, the only thing that I could not get to work was the process list option, -- process list, which basically queries MySQL periodically, runs show process list, and then aggregates the query over time. That did not work to me. It was not much of a deal breaker at the time, so I did not investigate. I don't think it's a very big problem because I don't see anything Windows or Linux specific there. It's just Perl talking to MySQL. So probably some other problem, but should be easy to resolve. PD table checksum worked like a charm, really. I was not able to use PD table sync because I didn't have to, but based on the result from running PD table checksum, I will hope it should run with minor adjustments. PT MySQL summary is actually a bash tool, so some of the parts don't run well, but it doesn't fail or abort. It's just that some of the data it gathers you just ignore it and that's it. But everything that is MySQL specific, which is most of what the tool does, works just as fine as in Linux. And then pdstock does not work out of the box, but with a very minor edit, you just need to go and find a function called check this space and set it to return 0. It will run fine. Of course, the function name should make it obvious, but if you make this edit, it removes one of the safety features. So just don't leave this running unsupervised on Windows because you could run out of disk space. That said, I think it's still worth using it. I find pdstock priceless due to my daily work. It was designed to find problems when you're not around, but I actually also use it when I am around. Sometimes you log into a system with some problem and what's going on is obvious, and you can see that just by looking at process list or entity status, and that's fine. But sometimes it's not, and you need to get more like a big picture. And the good thing is that pdstock, that invocation that I have there on the screen, the -- no stock iterations 1, that will trigger a capture right now and then exit. And this saves a lot of data, and it gives you a mostly consistent view of what's going on in the database at the time. I say mostly consistent because for the sake of performance, making it fully consistent would be too heavy. MySQL, this is not pdstock, it's MySQL, does not guarantee consistency, for example, in InnoDB status or even between InnoDB status and process list. All of that is just like a moving picture, but that's it. But it's better, so you don't have the pressure of saving output in case the problem goes away. You can just trigger this a few times and then you can look at the data, without the stress of having to do this live. Anything that was not on that previous slides, I have not used on Windows, to be honest. I will be happy to know if you try them and how it goes. You can just find my email at the end of the presentation and let me know. Like I said, I would expect the Perl ones to work just fine, and in the case of the bash ones, it's going to be like a bag of surprises. Just to show you how this is a capture of pdstock triggering. I set it to threshold set to 4, and then cycles, I left it at a default, which is 5. So basically this triggers if there are more than 4 running threads for 5 consecutive seconds. In the version that was used to make this screenshot includes the Band-Aid fix that I mentioned before. And here you can see what it writes. So while not all of the files are there, some of the files are just empty and pdstock removes them, and that's because they are Linux specific. A lot of them are, so it's still very useful to diagnose problems in Windows. I did not put this on the slides, but the companion tool, pdsift, that lets you, basically sift through many captures of pdstock, works fine too. Okay, besides Percona Toolkit as a bonus track, InnoTop, which is also a tool that I use. I'm not sure if daily, but definitely weekly, and it's very important depending on the case. It also works fine under Cwin. It's completely written in Perl, so that's not a big surprise, but it's still good to know it. In this capture, you can see the query list during a MySQL slab run. I apologize that all my examples are so boring, but I did not have any live Windows server available to gather some more interesting data. And this is the transactions view. So if we go back, these are the queries. So this is created from show process list. In this case, this is created from show engine InnoDB status. You can see that one of the nice things is that it uses a basic color scheme to bring your attention to things that are important. In this case, a long-running transaction. This is potentially very bad because if it's holding any lock, it will cause stalls globally. If it's not holding any big locks, it can still, for example, cause an alter table statement to just never start. So in general, you should never have transactions running for so long time. And it's a nice thing that InnoTop alerts you of that using the color schemes. By the way, all of these screenshots that I make are in different modes, and if you are running InnoTop, you can just type the question mark and it will show you a little help of all the modes that are there. This is the commands counter mode. You can see that the MySQL slab workload I was throwing at the server is basically doing insert and selects. Actually, it's doing primary key-based insert and it's doing full table scans. This is the lock weights view. You can see that it lets you quickly see who's blocking what. In this case, W thread is the waiting thread, B thread is the blocking thread, and this is a very silly example, because I did it on an idle server. But if you are using this on a live production server, you may have tens or maybe even up to hundreds of lines here, but you can still get B thread. And usually when you have very high contention, you can track it down to a single blocking thread here. And those IDs are actually MySQL thread ID. So this is something that you can see in show process list, and eventually you can kill with the kill command within MySQL client. Okay, so it's time to wrap up here. And I don't know what your reality is. In my case, like I said, I'm basically a Linux or Unix guy, and whenever I have to work here, I just, I found a little bit of problems, and I think that if I adapt a little bit and also I make Windows adapt a little bit, like install Cwin, I can get pretty much productive and resolve situations rather quickly. So I hope if you are in a similar situation, this has helped a bit. And thanks for coming and listening, and it's time for answers now. If you have any questions, and I can also follow up on the blog post or directly by email. Thanks.
Okay, Fernando, thank you very, very much. Folks, if you have any questions, please take a moment and go ahead and enter them into the questions window in the GoToWebinar control panel. Right now we don't have any questions, Fernando, so I think that you did a really good job. People are saying you did a great job. So what we
that or they're all asleep. Hopefully not everybody's sleeping.
I thought it was fun. Anyhow, people, thank you so much for your time today. I will make sure that a recording is given. Oh, wait, we got a question. Okay, Fernando, you ready? Are these Percona tools licensed? How do you get the Percona tools that he's talking about?
Yes, these are all, actually let me put a message for you here, Lisa, but these are all GPL, so it's basically free software. You can go to percona.com and then find a software link, and you can also, with the Percona Toolkits, can you reply, or is there a way I can write a message to everyone? I don't think so, right?
Well, if you put it in the chat,
okay.
Yeah, I can. If you put it in the chat window, I will go ahead and copy and paste it into the questions panel for everybody. So.
Okay.
All right.
So you can send that, please. That URL that Elisa is going to send to you guys now, basically percona.com/get/tool name, that will let you download every tool by name. So for example, if you wanted to have PT Query Digest, you can just go and download percona.com/get/PT Query Digest. And that URL, the get one, will always bring you the latest stable version. So if you want anything more specific, like an older version for whatever reason, or just look at the history, then you can go to the downloads page on the Percona.com page, and you will find it all there. But as for the licensing, it's all GPL.
Okay, great. The next question is, I know you said there are no Percona binaries, but what are the chances for that ever changing?
Well, I asked the CTO and I asked others in development, and that's why I put that big disclaimer about us being 100% customer driven. If customers start to ask for that, we'll make them. It is not impossible. As far as I know, we still don't have even internal binaries of 5.6, but we do have for 5.1.5. But again, it's just that development for us has to be paid by customer work, because we are not like it. That's all we do. We are working to improve actual real-life customer cases. So I think the answer is not a permanent no. I'm hoping that eventually we will have binaries. I think with Oracle making the push to get more people using MySQL in Windows, definitely I'm seeing more cases now. I think we're going to be following there eventually. But again, it's my personal opinion, not an official statement.
Okay, great. The next question is there any project to extend MySQL cluster and MySQL cluster to Windows platform?
If MySQL cluster, the NDB cluster, I think it should work already. Actually, I saw a bug report 2 days ago or so, but I would have to send the person asking the question to the Oracle website, because I don't have that much experience with NDB. And as for if the question was about Percona XDB cluster, no plans for now. And I see those a little bit more difficult as for Percona Server, because in that case we are combining the work of Percona and Codership, the guys that write Galera. And as far as I know, Galera is also just Linux or Unix specific now. So I see that one as a bit more difficult.
Okay. Next question. Does the Percona version have JSON features?
I'll have to look that up and get back later. I don't know the answer, honestly.
Okay. And let me see here. I think that is it for questions. I don't see any others. So what I will do after this webinar is over is I will send all these questions over to Fernando, and he will go ahead and address anything that I might have missed. And also, like I said, I will send out a recording of this webinar in addition to the slides, so everyone will have a copy. So with that said, Fernando, thank you so much for the webinar today. And audience, thank you so much for joining us. And I hope that you had a very insightful session. And have a wonderful day, evening, morning, depending on where you're listening from. Thank you very much, everyone.